One blood-red afternoon in Voss Valley, 300 warriors on horseback appeared like shadows along the ridgelines, silent as feathered ghosts, while the townsfolk huddled in prayer inside the old wooden church. Eyes wide behind cracked shutters, a 17-year-old girl stepped out into the open. No rifle in her hands, no white flag, just a calm face and a story no one dared to believe. The silence was heavier than the threat of gunfire, and it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would shoot first. Only God could explain why all of this began with a piece of warm cornbread. If you think this story is about a battle, you're only half right. But if you believe that it all started with one girl's kindness to a starving child, then you're about to witness the strangest standoff the West has ever known. Sometimes the line between life and death, war and peace, is as thin as a slice of bread. So lean in. Let me tell you the tale of Magnolia Voss, the girl who changed everything with a single act of foolish mercy. It didn't start with a raid. No gunshots, no war cries echoing through the valley, just a quiet morning on a quiet farm where the sun spilled gold over rows of corn and hens clucked lazily in the coop. Magnolia Voss had no reason to expect anything different that day. Her boots were dusty, her apron stained with flour, and in her hand was a basket of eggs still warm from the nest. But fate has a way of creeping in through the back door, dressed in silence and looking like a starving child. She heard the rustling first behind the chicken coop, soft and cautious like the wind brushing tall grass. Most folks out here would have grabbed their rifle before checking, but Maggie wasn't most folks. She moved slow, careful each step, measured not out of fear, but something deeper, like the feeling when a storm's coming and the birds go quiet. And there, huddled between the slats of old wood, was a boy. His skin was the color of river mud, stretched over sharp bones, and his eyes held the same look Maggie had seen in the mirror after her mama passed, lost, scared and alone, in a world too big for one heart to carry. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at her with a wildness that said he was ready to run, fight or die. Maggie, with her breath caught somewhere in her throat, didn't call for her father. She didn't raise her voice or step back. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the piece of cornbread she'd saved from breakfast, still soft, still warm. She placed it gently on the ground and stepped away. The boy's eyes flicked from the bread to her face, as if trying to understand a language older than words. Then, quick as a rabbit, he snatched it up, devouring it in 3 bites. Maggie thought he might cry, but he didn't. He just looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but something close. A recognition that in this vast, unforgiving land kindness was as rare as rain in August. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to know where his people were, why he was alone, how long since he'd eaten. But the sound of her father's voice broke the moment like a twig underfoot. The boy vanished, swallowed by the tall grass, as if he'd never been. And Maggie stood there, basket in hand, her heart pounding harder than it ever had during a Sunday sermon. She didn't know it yet, but that small act offering bread instead of bullets had just drawn a line across the prairie. And before the sun would rise again, 300 warriors would ride to the edge of her world holding that very piece of bread like it was a flag of war. Or peace, because what Maggie gave that morning wasn't just food. It was a choice, a whisper against the roar of history. And now that choice was echoing louder than any gunshot. And that brings us to Magnolia Voss, the girl who looked twice. Magnolia wasn't the kind of girl the prairie expected. She didn't carry a pistol on her hip or chew tobacco like some of the ranch girls did. She knew how to churn butter, mend a fence, and break a colt without breaking its spirit. But more than that, Maggie had a way of seeing the world that others in her town had long forgotten. Where most folks saw danger, she sometimes saw sorrow. And where others turned away, Maggie looked again. She'd grown up in the shadow of hard men and harder times. Her father, Sterling Maddox, had survived 3 raids and carried the scars to prove it, one on his shoulder, another across his heart. He was the kind of man who measured safety in the number of bullets he kept loaded and trust by how far a man kept his distance. After Maggie's mother passed the previous winter, he hardened even more, like frost settling deep into old wood. But Maggie hadn't frozen over with him. Something in her stayed soft, like the bread she'd saved that morning. Most days she kept her thoughts to herself. A young woman speaking too boldly in the Voss Valley was bound to be met with silence or worse, suspicion. But she noticed things. How old Mrs. Hensley's hands trembled when she lit her lamp. How the young preacher flinched whenever the wind slammed the chapel door. And how fear, once planted in a town, grew faster than corn in spring. Maggie had learned that sometimes it was the quiet ones who saw most clearly. So when she saw that boy by the chicken coop starving and wild-eyed, she didn't just see a threat. She saw someone who didn't belong to the list of enemies her father kept in his head. She saw a child, not a scout, not a trick, just a child. And that made all the difference. Because in a place where folks were taught to shoot first and ask later, Maggie did the unthinkable. She hesitated. What Maggie couldn't have known was that her hesitation was about to shake everything her father believed in. It would put her faith against his fury, her mercy against a lifetime of battle scars. And by the time the dust settled, their quiet homestead would no longer be just a place to gather eggs or mend fences. It would become the line where two worlds collided. A daughter's compassion and a father's fear set on a collision course. And the first crack in that collision would come with a voice shouting from across the field, warning of fresh tracks in the dirt. The moment Maggie laid eyes on him, something shifted. He wasn't just a stranger. He was smaller than she expected, thinner too. Just bones under skin with clothes hanging off him like wet laundry on a wire. His face was streaked with dirt, but it was his eyes that held her in place. Eyes like a hunted creature's, wide, unblinking, too tired to flee, too afraid to stay. And in those eyes, Maggie saw a question that no words could ask. Will you see me as I am? Or as what they've told you I must be? The boy gripped a jagged stick like it was the last thing tethering him to the living. His knuckles were scraped and his feet were bare. Every inch of him screamed survival. Maggie didn't speak. She simply reached into the folds of her apron and pulled out the piece of cornbread, soft golden and still warm with the morning. She knelt down slowly, placing it on the grass like an offering to a wounded god, then stepped back. The boy didn't rush forward. He waited, scanning her like a coyote sniffing a trap. When he finally reached for the bread, it was with lightning speed, 3 bites, and it was gone, swallowed like a memory. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't run either. He just stared at her crumbs still clinging to his lips, and Maggie felt a strange heat rise behind her eyes. Not pity, not guilt, just a deep knowing that this boy had seen too much of the world, far too young. She wanted to ask his name, but didn't. She wanted to ask where he came from, but knew it wasn't the time. What she didn't want was for him to vanish, but that's exactly what happened. The moment her father's voice rang out across the yard, sharp and close, the boy moved like smoke in wind. One blink, and he was gone. Tall grass behind the coop swallowed him whole, leaving only the memory of his eyes and a few stray crumbs glinting in the sun. Maggie stood frozen for a heartbeat longer, her fingers still curled from where they'd held the bread. She told herself she'd imagined it all, but deep down she knew better. That boy was real, and the look in his eyes of hunger, fear, and something almost like hope was already taking root in her chest. What she didn't know was that 300 men were already searching for him, and one of them was willing to set the prairie on fire to get him back. By noon, the sky above Voss Valley had turned the color of gunmetal, heavy, low, and restless. The breeze had stilled like the earth itself was listening. It wasn't just the weather that had changed. Something in the air had shifted, subtle at first, like the hush before a preacher delivers bad news. The birds were quieter. Even the horses seemed uneasy, stamping and twitching, as if they too sensed what was coming. Ezra Whitmore came riding fast across the field, his horse lathered with sweat hooves, digging furrows in the dry ground. Dust trailed behind him like smoke from a fuse. He didn't dismount, just leaned over the saddle, shouting before he was within 20 paces. "Sterling, we got trouble." His voice cracked high and sharp, and that alone was enough to set Maggie's stomach turning. Ezra wasn't the type to scare easy, but his eyes told a story that words only blurred. "Fresh tracks," he said. "Too many to be a hunting party. Deep, deliberate heading straight through their land. Not aimless, not wandering, searching." That word alone put a chill in the room, colder than any wind. Sterling's jaw tightened, and without needing to say it, everyone in earshot began to gather their things. Maggie stood on the porch, hands trembling slightly, the image of the boy behind the coop burning bright in her mind. She knew deep in the marrow of her bones this was about him. Inside the house, her father checked the rifle slung above the mantel. It was clean loaded and worn smooth from years of use. His hands didn't shake. But Maggie noticed how long he stared out the window, as if trying to see the shape of a war forming in the hills. "We'll gather the families," he said finally, voice tight. "If there's a war party out there, we meet it together." There was no fear in his tone, only that old iron resolve. But Maggie felt the fear for both of them. By mid-afternoon, the church bell began tolling slow, steady, and grim. It was the sound no settler ever wanted to hear. It meant danger. It meant run or fight. And it meant that whatever peace had held over the valley these past 2 years was cracking underfoot. As folks poured into the center of town, carrying rifles, children, and prayers, Maggie realized something else. No one was asking why the warriors had come. Only when they would strike. And in the silence between those bell tolls, Maggie couldn't help but wonder, what if they weren't here to strike at all? The sun was just beginning to fall behind the western ridge when the first silhouettes appeared still as a stone, framed by fire-colored sky. At first, folks thought they were trees or tricks of the light. But as more emerged, lined up along the hills like the ridgeline itself had grown a spine, the truth settled over the town like a burial shroud. Riders, hundreds of them, each one mounted unmoving, cloaked in silence deeper than any sermon. No war cries, no drums, just the low hum of wind weaving between horse and man and the flicker of feathers dancing against the dying light. Pastor Williams was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not attacking," he said almost in disbelief. And he was right. The warriors didn't move. They didn't raise bows or rifles. They simply watched. Maggie pressed her face to the window of the old church, her breath fogging the glass. Even from this distance, she could see how still they were, like statues carved from dusk itself. But her eyes weren't looking for the masses. They were searching for the center where, sure enough, one figure stood out. An elder, silver-haired, painted in ceremonial marks, holding something small in both hands. It glinted in the light. It was white. It was square, and Maggie's heart skipped when she realized it was the cornbread. The same piece she had given the boy that morning, now wrapped carefully in leather, offered like a sacred relic. The old man didn't raise it high, didn't shout. He simply held it facing the town, as if waiting to see if anyone would understand the meaning without words. Maggie's breath caught. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. Not of war, but of memory. Behind her, murmurs rose like smoke. Some settlers gripped their guns tighter. Others loosened their fingers, uncertain. Sterling Maddox stood motionless by the church door. His jaw clenched, his rifle hanging just low enough to mean he hadn't decided which way to lift it. For the first time in his life, he saw an enemy not charging, but waiting. And he didn't know what to do with that. Maggie did. And as the valley held its breath, she knew this wasn't an invasion. This was a question. And someone had to answer. Inside the old church, the air was thick with the weight of silence. No one dared to speak first. Rifles rested on laps and windowsills, fingers twitching near triggers, but eyes were fixed on the hills. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing something far bigger than themselves, unfolding just beyond those wooden walls. Maggie sat in the front pew, her hands balled in her skirt, her thoughts louder than any whisper around her. She couldn't take her eyes off the man holding the cornbread. Her cornbread. She knew then what had to be done. It wasn't courage, exactly not the kind her father would recognize. It was something deeper, older, born of shame and truth tangled together. She rose slowly, heart pounding hard enough to make her vision swim. "Pa," she said just above a whisper. "That boy, the one they're looking for. I saw him." Sterling turned like a whip cracked in air, his eyes narrowing. "You saw him?" He repeated the room instantly, holding its breath. Maggie nodded, tears threatening but not yet falling. "Behind the chicken coop. He was starving, Pa. Just a boy. I gave him bread." The words dropped into the room like a stone in a still pond. Ripples of disbelief, anger, confusion spread across the faces of neighbors who'd watched her grow up. Her father's face changed, first pale, then flushed with something between rage and fear. His voice lowered, rough like gravel under boot. "You did what, girl?" Maggie straightened her hands, no longer shaking. "I gave him bread. He wasn't a threat. He was lost." Sterling looked like a man who'd just been told the storm wasn't coming. It was already here, and his own daughter had opened the gate. But before he could say another word, something outside changed. The drum stopped, and the sudden stillness was louder than any sound. Through the window, the silver-haired elder lowered the cornbread and stepped forward alone, unarmed, walking down the hill with a solemn grace. The settlers froze. No one moved. And Maggie, in the space between fear and faith, began walking toward the door. She heard her father behind her. "You're not going out there." But she was already there in the aisle at the threshold where dust and light met wood. She turned her head just enough to speak. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it already. He's not coming for war. He's coming for an answer. And as she stepped outside, the valley itself seemed to exhale, like it too had been waiting for someone to speak the truth first. The elder stopped 20 paces from the church steps, the leather-wrapped bread still in his hand. His painted face was lined with age and wind, but his eyes, clear, steady, and unblinking, met Maggie's with something close to peace. He did not speak right away. He let the silence settle first like dust after a long ride. When he did speak, his voice was low, and even the kind of voice that had told stories long before English ever found its way west. "You are the girl who gave my grandson bread." A hush fell over the crowd behind Maggie, heavy with disbelief. The chief explained slowly, with weight behind each word, that the boy's name was Ayanna. He had been lost 3 days ago in a summer storm, separated from their camp, feared dead. They had tracked him across riverbeds and dry brush, not to scout or raid, but to bring him home. And when he returned, it wasn't with fear or blood, but with a story of a girl with soft eyes who gave him food instead of fear. Maggie swallowed hard. Behind her, she felt the heat of her father's stare, but she didn't look back. Her eyes stayed on the old man, who now held the cornbread out, not as a threat, but as proof. "We came in numbers," he said, "not for war, but because there are others who seek war in our name." The crowd stirred, confused. That's when he said the name Clearwater Company. Sterling stiffened. He knew the name. Everyone did. Men who traveled the frontier under the flag of protection, but left nothing but graves behind. Mercenaries. Thieves in uniforms. The chief explained they had taken Ayanna first, hoping to provoke his people into a blind retaliation. Then they would come to the settlers, as saviors kill the warriors, and claim the land in gratitude. It was an old game, one played many times before. But this time, it had failed. Because Ayanna survived. Because a girl shared bread. Maggie felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. One small act had undone a whole chain of cruelty. But as the chief turned his head toward the eastern hills, his voice hardened. "They come now," he said, "to finish what they started, unless we stop them together." And as the first riders appeared in the distance, white men with polished guns and cruel smiles, Maggie knew the real war was only just arriving. They came riding 2 by 2 30 men, in sharp coats and polished boots, rifles gleaming in the last rays of sun. Their leader, a scar-faced man, with a cavalry mustache and a silver-plated revolver, carried a white flag tied to the barrel of his gun. But there was no peace in the way he rode, no humility in the tilt of his chin. His flag was a mockery, and his smile held the kind of cruelty that knew it would be forgiven once the land changed hands. This wasn't a rescue party. It was a performance. He stopped just short of the churchyard and raised his voice smooth as oil on a snake's back. "Seems like we've got ourselves a little standoff," he called, eyes scanning the native ranks, then settling on Maggie. "And look at that, they've already taken a hostage." Sterling stepped out, then slow and deliberate, rifle at the ready, but lowered. "That's my daughter," he said, voice like a closed fist. "And she's exactly where she chose to be." The mercenary laughed, but it rang false. His men began to fan out, forming a wall between the settlers and the tribal warriors. Behind Maggie, the church doors creaked open again. One by one, the townsfolk emerged. Ezra Whitmore, Pastor Williams, young Tommy with his father's rifle. Even old Mrs. Patterson leaning on her cane with a shotgun in her good hand. They didn't speak. They just walked forward, drawing a line in the dust with their feet. And then, in a moment, no one expected, Sterling Maddox, war veteran widower, hard as frontier stone, stepped to the chief's side. Not behind, beside. He turned slowly and faced the men from Clearwater. "We didn't ask for your protection," he said, "and we sure as hell won't trade our souls for it." There was no applause, no cheers, just stillness, the kind that comes when decent men finally stop being afraid. The chief gave a single nod and barked a short command. His warriors moved not forward to strike, but outward, encircling the valley, forming a protective crescent that included the settlers inside it. For the first time in living memory, rifles once pointed at each other were now aimed in the same direction. And as the mercenaries raised their weapons in reply, it became clear this wouldn't be a war of sides. It would be a war of truth against profit honor, against greed. The first shot didn't come from the mercenaries. It came from Tommy Fletcher, barely 16, heart-pounding like a war drum, who saw the scar-faced man raise his rifle toward Maggie and didn't wait for permission. His bullet caught the man high in the shoulder, spinning him off his horse with a curse and a crash. That one shot broke the spell. The stillness shattered. And suddenly, the valley roared to life. But it wasn't chaos, not like the mercenaries had expected. This wasn't a scramble of scared settlers and disorganized warriors. It was swift. It was sharp. It was unity. The tribes moved like flowing water, communicating without words, using the land as if they were born from it. The settlers, guided by instinct and desperation, followed suit, covering flanks, protecting the children holding lines. For the first time in that valley's history, the blood was shed not in hatred, but in defense of something shared. Maggie ducked behind the church well, her breath ragged, but her eyes clear. She saw Ayanna dart across the field, a carving knife in hand, not to attack, but to cut the reins of a mercenary's panicked horse, sending it barreling into enemy lines. The boy moved like wind, untouchable, his spirit lit with fire. And Maggie, despite the dust, the gunpowder, and the cries of men, felt something close to hope rise in her chest. The Clearwater men fought hard, but they didn't fight smart. They hadn't counted on being outnumbered not by bodies, but by belief. Their lines broke in under 20 minutes. Some fled, dropping weapons as they ran. Others were surrounded and surrendered, hands raised in disbelief at the unity that they had tried so hard to prevent. Sterling stood over one of them, rifle still warm, and said quietly, "Next time you start a war, make sure no one's got a reason to stand together." When the smoke cleared, the meadow was torn, but not ruined. Bodies lay still beneath broken saddles and spent shells. But between the loss and the silence, something new had taken root. Warriors helped settlers lift the wounded. A child handed water to a man whose skin didn't match his own. And in the center of it all, Maggie stood, dust in her hair, cornbread long gone, but the meaning of it more powerful than ever. Because in a valley where people once pointed rifles at each other across fence lines, they had now pointed them shoulder to shoulder and chosen to protect the fragile thing called peace. The sun dipped low over Voss Valley, casting long amber shadows that made everything seem quieter, softer somehow. Where gunfire had thundered that morning, now there was only the rustle of wind through grass and the slow, steady voices of men and women working side by side. Warriors gathered wood for burial fires. Settlers brought cloth and tools to tend the wounded. No one spoke of sides anymore, only of names of losses and of what needed to be done before nightfall. Maggie sat on the edge of the church steps, her dress stained with dust and memory. In her hands were two carvings, one shaped like a bird, the other a wolf. Gifts from Ayanna, who now sat beside her chewing a piece of dried meat with a smile too big for his young face. "We saved each other," he told her earlier, and she believed it. Not just he and she, but all of them. Saved by kindness, by something as simple as a girl who looked twice instead of turning away. Sterling approached slowly, his broad frame casting a long shadow over his daughter. He didn't speak right away. When he did, it was quiet, like the hush between verses of a hymn. "Your mother," he said, "she would have been proud." Maggie looked up, eyes wet but shining. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, not heavy with control like before, but steady, with understanding, with respect. "You reminded us of something we forgot out here," he said. "That it don't cost a soul to be decent." The chief stood nearby, watching the valley, not as a man claiming victory, but as one measuring the weight of survival. He exchanged a long, wordless glance with Sterling, and the two men nodded. A new kind of treaty had been written that day, not in ink or blood, but in action. And it wasn't signed by governments or generals. It was signed by farmers, warriors, children, and a girl who gave bread when she could have given fear. Peace in Voss Valley didn't come easy. It never does. It came with pain, with loss, with hard reckonings. But it came. And some say even now, when the wind moves just right through the tall grass behind the church, you can still hear the soft crunch of bare feet and the rustle of a boy's voice telling stories about the girl who didn't look away. What do you think folks can? One act of kindness really changed the course of a people's fate. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes in the power of mercy. And don't forget to subscribe, because we've got more tales where courage meets the dust and decency never goes out of style.